Okay, so we can start. Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. This is the first of the series of seminars, the New Hampshire Experimentation Seminar Series on Sustainable Agriculture. And the second one would be on the 20th. So today we are very happy to start our seminar series with Professor Nicholson from the Smeal College of Business at Penn State and the Bryson School of Applied Economics at Cornell University. Dr. Nicholson did his PhD at Cornell University, master's at Cornell, and undergrad at UC Davis. And he's been working on the economics of localizing food systems, specifically in dairy supply chains, which is a very good way to start our seminar series. And Chuck is also editor of Agricultural Systems, the journal Agricultural Systems. Welcome, and thanks everyone for being here.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. One of the things that made me really excited about the opportunity to come here is that I am really an agricultural systems modeler trapped in a supply chain management body. So I don't get to have any opportunities in a college of business to talk about the kinds of issues with folks like you who have a greater passion, interest, and background. So I'm really pleased to have that opportunity. So again, thank you for the invitation to be here. So I have a prop that I'd like to use here. I bought this at the UNH dairy bar. Okay, it's dairy pure milk. Maybe you don't know this, but you can look on pretty much any fluid dairy product, and there's a number that begins with the state FIPS code, and it actually tells you in which state this particular product was put into this bottle. This was brought up here from a plant in the state of Massachusetts, probably in the Boston area. I didn't get a chance in the time we had to check the specific plant, but it's from Massachusetts. Don't really know where the milk came from for that. Okay, so imagine this milk, and if I had another imaginary bottle of milk from the Penn State Creamery, which would be Pennsylvania milk, undoubtedly from the dairy farm on the campus. I could ask you which of those two you might prefer. I could also then extend it and say, heaven forbid, what if I got milk from a creamery out in California? Which of those would you prefer? Which of those would you prefer? And why?
I would be indifferent between Pennsylvania and Massachusetts milk because it's within the Northeast region and I don't really differentiate those.
Oh, you're a regional boundary kind of person, I see. Okay. What about California milk?
I would choose the regional milk over the California milk because I know how much irrigation California dairy systems rely on, and that would be my deciding factor, I think, in terms of ecological sustainability. Thinking about water stress, particularly in that region.
Well, the good news about water stress in California is that dairy production is actually declining out there, so there'll be less water stress in the future. They don't think so, that it's so good, but in any case. So the reason I brought this up is I want to actually talk about this particular product in more detail, and a lot of what we need to think about is what our perceptions are and what our values are. I've had a lot of good discussions already with folks that relate to the idea that local food is often perceived in certain ways as being better, might be healthier, might be higher quality. We can talk about milk composition, all that kind of stuff, whether it came from happy cows, which actually in California are not really that happy, but never mind about that. Might be lower cost. You actually mentioned some environmental considerations that we might think about, often considered better for the environment and also better for our economy. We spend dollars locally, we keep that money local. Right? So this is the basic view that a lot of folks have, not just for milk, but more broadly for local products from agriculture. Okay? So this kind of sets up the background for what I'm going to talk about, which is a collaborative project between myself and actually primarily transportation engineers, but they're nice guys anyway. We started actually down this path about 7 years ago, thinking about the growing interest on the part of consumers, but also policymakers. And I've heard a lot of discussions about how policymakers in the Northeast, and particularly here in New Hampshire, are really interested in the idea of the potential for regionalizing and localizing food systems. There are a variety of different forms that this takes, from regional food hubs to farm-to-school programs, farmers market promotion, CSA promotion. And I'm not going to talk about all of those things in any detail, but this kind of provides the background for the setup for what I want to have us talk about. The Northeast is also kind of a hotbed for these efforts compared to some other places, although if you look at this 2016 Locavore Index, Oregon and Montana also make the list along with Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire as being kind of areas where there's greater attention paid to this kind of potential. So we actually had previously done some work looking at trying to regionalize the entire U.S. fluid milk supply. We published that in Food Policy. And what we found was that if you try to take the current sort of supply chains that provide milk to consumers and localize them as much as you can, you would actually increase costs to do so. And you would actually increase the total amount of mileage that fluid milk and all dairy products overall would travel. And this actually works against kind of a lot of what I introduced as the perceptions that we have about what localization would do, which one of the things would be shorter distances and lower costs. Following on that, we realized we hadn't actually looked at some other things that might be important. Partly we had funding from USDA's Africa Grants Program for a regionalization project. We also recognize that states have put additional efforts into promoting their own state-produced agricultural products, state origin promotion campaigns. A couple of these, PA, where I work primarily, has what they call PA Preferred. I'm showing you here for milk. New York has Pride of New York state. I went to actually the New Hampshire Department of Agriculture website, and I saw this thing that said New Hampshire's own, which sounds a little bit like Paul Newman, but I couldn't actually find anything more about what that actually meant, but it probably means that there's some idea that it would be good if you bought New Hampshire stuff if you live in New Hampshire. So what we wanted to do was to take this basic idea of regionalizing or localizing food systems and approach it from a little bit more of a systems-oriented perspective to ask questions like, if we could take all of the milk in the states in the Northeast and make sure that that milk was produced, processed, and consumed in the same state, what would be the impacts of that? And actually, this is based on one of USDA's sort of vague definitions about what local is, which is produced in the same state. California, I guess that means if you consume something in San Diego, it could be produced in Chico, and that's still local, even though that's like 700 miles, right? So we're going to use the Northeast states and fluid milk as a case study, but the ultimate thing that I want you to take away from this is not exactly about only milk, but it's also related to the basic idea of having a systems approach to think about impacts, and particularly when you think about scaling up the kinds of programs that are proposed. So we're going to actually look at a broader set of impacts than we looked at in our food policy paper. We'll look at food miles, supply chain costs. Those are things we looked at previously, but we added to this with the help of the transportation engineers, greenhouse gas emissions. And then we went a little bit further in looking at the economic analysis to think about what is the level of additional income that's generated and what are the employment impacts. And so we want to think from a broader perspective about scaling up localization and see what happens. So this was work that was actually published in late 2015, early 2016 in Environmental Science and Technology. There's all kinds of additional details in there if you're at all interested, including supplemental materials that are longer than the actual journal article itself. Those were kind of a requirement paper being published. Again, collaboration with Miguel Gomez and the Diocese of Cornell and our transportation engineer friends in environmental engineering, civil and environmental engineering. So in our overall objectives, let's look at a systems perspective on regionalizing fluid milk, and again, noting the things that we would look at. We're also going to focus on fluid milk for what we think about as the regionalization. We want to regionalize that, and fluid milk in this case means stuff like the container that I had there, but also what you buy in a grocery store. But we're not regionalizing the other products that are made from farm milk, which would include yogurt and cheese and butter and milk powders. So our justification, again, dairy is important in the Northeast, particularly so in New York and Pennsylvania, but also in Vermont, maybe a little bit less so here in New Hampshire, but still an important activity. We also wanted to use a product that was known to a lot of consumers. Fluid milk is very frequently purchased, especially by a certain demographic in retail stores. And this is a product that's actually highly regionalized already, so there's some potential to think about how you might make it more regionalized. About 98% of milk that's sold in the grocery store in the Northeast actually comes from farms and is processed in the Northeast already. We're going to do a little bit of additional playing around with that definition to do our analysis, but you can imagine that's a little bit different than trying to grow all the tomatoes that would be consumed in New Hampshire. Okay. So we already have a product that's largely regionalized. So the motivation in part is that we don't know a lot about what would happen if we scale up a lot of what are often conceived of as successful efforts to produce food locally and to market it locally. And we wanted to think about that scaling up and the reallocation of resources that would be required as one of the components of our analysis. So we also kind of want to have people have a vision that if you're thinking about something like the 50 by 60 initiative that people have been talking about with me earlier this morning, that actually requires a lot of structural transformations of an entire food system that are pretty difficult to achieve, even if we have willing consumers and willing producers. So we want to have a little bit more of a systems and supply chain perspective on this issue. So regionalization has potential impacts on the costs, on food miles, on truck emissions, and on employment and economic activity. And we want to look in more detail at those and again, a broader systems perspective on this. How do we do this? Again, I think a way to describe it is we really needed folks from multiple disciplines to contribute. We used a suite of different simulation models, some developed by us, some developed by others. Detailed dairy supply chain model that I'm primarily responsible for. I'll tell you more about that in a second. Some of you may be familiar with the MOVES model that EPA puts out. It actually is a truck transportation emissions calculation model. We look at CO2, particulate matter, and NOx. This is primarily the transportation engineers. And then for the economic and employment impacts, we used an economics tool and input output modeling, for which there is a model called Incline to allow us to do that. So we had to have ways for these models to talk with one another. We had to collaborate in a way to make this all work. Supply chain model basically minimizes the cost of getting milk from farms to consumers, including the processing. It's a spatially oriented model. I'll show you more about that in a second. Has a detailed spatial representation of all 48 states. And one of the reasons that this is important is that dairy markets are very integrated both within the US and globally now, so we can't just look at one little sector like the Northeast, because there can be spin-off effects that I'll show you more about in a second. Trade is also really important, so we had to include that in our assessment. The spatial component looks a little bit like this. We have farm production locations. These are multi-county areas. The size of the blue dot tells you roughly proportionally how much milk is there. So you can see that we have kind of more spatially dense network in the eastern part of the US. Then we get out to the west, the production is actually more spatially concentrated. We have different processing locations for all the different products in this approach. And then we have demand locations where we need product to be made available to consumers. And in each of these cases, we assume that those are fixed, but what we're going to talk about is the way in which things move from a farm to a processing facility and to a demand location. What we're taking is given the farm level production and the demand. And so once we do that, we're going to figure out which approach is the least cost to go farm to plant, processing at the plant, and distribution to final demand. I like to think about this in the following way. We're going to go from cows to plants. We have money involved in moving milk from the farm to the plant. We have money involved in processing. And we have money involved in getting a product to the demand location. And again, I like to think about this a little bit like a dairy dictator who is going to say, this is the direction that is things are going to be moved on. I would like for you to note my restraint in not using any domestic personages in this particular slide, although we do have somebody who's quite newsworthy these days. But what we're trying to do is look at the basic incentives for a supply chain to be organized, which is moving towards cost minimization when we have a commodity product like fluid milk and dairy products. Okay. So we're using data for 2 months in 2011, March to September. March is generally a surplus month in most parts of the country. September tends to be a short month, so we get a little bit of a titration on that particular effect. Provides incentives for the organization of the supply chain. There's some things that we didn't include that relate primarily to pricing regulation that are less relevant for what we're looking at here, but also we don't have a lot of emotion involved about this cooperative has a particular plant location, always has to be like that. So we extract a little bit from those things. One of the things that's key to understanding where we're going with this is, many of you are probably familiar with this, but farm milk has a lot of different competing uses, and it also has the ability to be fractionated into a bunch of different components. Composition of milk varies by breed and by region, so we need to account for those things essentially to have the right kind of mass balance. Right? So the component mass balance needs to be taken care of. Many dairy products are also used, believe it or not, as input in other dairy products. An example is many cheese plants will use non-fat dry milk or cream to enhance the yields of their particular production process. And so we needed to take that into account as well to have appropriate representation of this supply chain. This just kind of illustrates the fact that there's a lot of different ways in which you can use milk, and this ultimately becomes important when we think about the following. Farm milk is a limited resource that has a bunch of different potential uses. So if we are saying we're going to start with farm milk and we want to reallocate it so that it is more locally used in fluid, that has some potential implications for other products in a particular region. And that could actually mean that the distances are shorter perhaps for fluid milk, but could also be then made larger and cost higher for other products. And as a system, we would take into account all of those effects, not just the ones on fluid milk. Okay. Don't have to go into a lot of detail, but I just want to give you a visual representation that we're trying to account for all the major dairy product categories as part of this, again, to be consistent with the systems approach and mass balance. And we also account for this idea that one dairy plant can sell product to another dairy plant for use. We actually allow for that to be determined by what we do in our modeling framework. Okay. So we also used information from food science folks to help us develop these kinds of relationships. And this smiling fellow here, from Dave Barbano, famous around the world for his work on cheese and milk fractionation. We worked with people in the hauling industry to have better data on and develop better estimates for the transportation costs, especially for farm milk assembly. So we had to do some additional background work to allow this to happen. We developed an online tool that allowed tracking of the costs. And we work with dairy companies to develop better estimates of processing costs. So again, we talk about us and the transportation engineers, but we also involve people from other disciplines to help us set the data inputs required. And then, of course, we get to this beautiful way of representing what it is we're doing, which is a bunch of GAMS codes. You all got that? So we then actually put this into an optimization modeling framework, and that's going to give us the base inputs that we need to do some of the other things that we will do. Right? We evaluated this by looking at how well the model predicted production in the major dairy product categories reported by the National Ag Statistics Service for different states. We found high correlations between model outputs and those reported data. We had industry experts, 4 of them, do an evaluation more qualitatively about the flows of product in and milk in the model. Generally speaking, they said, hey, this actually really looks good. It's consistent with our industry experience. And we also did sensitivity analysis that suggested that the results were not sensitive to a lot of our basic assumptions about supply and demand. On the emission side, we used EPA's simulation tool to calculate the different CO2 equivalent emissions and particulate matter emissions. We're using the specific trucks that are used in the dairy industry. Class 7 and 8 are the ones that are used here. We use distances and routings from the supply chain model with the input to calculate these. So notice we're actually not focusing on greenhouse gas emissions from things like the farms themselves, which would be actually the primary source of environmental issues in dairy, in the dairy supply chain. We're also not looking at what's going on with processing facilities. We're really only looking here at the transportation that is being affected by the reallocation of milk to localize. Right? On the income and employment side, we basically looked at the value addition that was generated for 4 dairy product categories, and then because these are the ones that are available to use in the input-output modeling, then we have a way of using multipliers to figure out what the overall effect is. Okay. So we had 2 basic comparisons. We did a baseline scenario, and then we had 2 alternatives. And the first alternative was one that I'll probably talk about a little bit more. States that are self-sufficient in milk, we would basically say, okay, we're going to constrain your supply chain so that the milk has to be produced, processed, and consumed by consumers for the fluid milk product all within that state. The states that are included in that are this one, but also New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Maine. The other Northeast states don't have sufficient milk to meet their own fluid milk needs. Another possibility is to think about subregions within the Northeast, one of which would be New England, New York, New Jersey, and then the remaining states that were in our analysis, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. Say, doesn't have to be within the same state, but it has to be within that subregion that the milk is produced, processed, and consumed. Okay. So these are the 2 ways in which we're going to think about implementing the idea of localizing or regionalizing. And I'll mention this now because we had a little bit of a conversation about it at lunch, but one of the things that I expected reviewers from the Environmental Science and Technology Journal to come back and say to me was, this is preposterous. There's no way that we would expect 100% of the product to be produced, farm milk to be produced, processed, and consumed within the same state. That's too big a scaling up. And then I heard about the 50 by 60 initiative, which actually is, in some level, way beyond that because it's encompassing a lot more of the overall production and a lot more challenges. So this is actually our way of trying to implement the idea of what scaled up localization looks like. So it's actually kind of important for us to recognize what it is that we're doing. All right. So with that in mind, let's actually look at a series of the results then. We're going to look at the miles traveled by fluid milk, and this is just the fluid milk product going from the farm to a processing facility to a consumer location. And I've got a number of the different states and then the overall Northeast, and I'm representing a change in total miles traveled here. Okay? And I got the 2 months, March and September of 2011, that we analyzed. And so for March, what we see is more than 10% increases in the total miles traveled for 2 states, New York and Pennsylvania. You here in New Hampshire actually have been blotted out by a green bar, at least the first of the letters in your states. There's actually a fairly large reduction in the miles traveled for milk consumed here in the state of New Hampshire. But overall, because New York and Pennsylvania are weighted more heavily towards milk consumption in the Northeast, there was an increase in the total miles traveled by fluid milk if we tried to localize. Same basic kind of result happened in September, even though there's a different supply-demand balance dynamic going on during that month. So, basic takeaway, when we regionalize using the definitions that we looked at, we have an increase in the total miles traveled by the fluid milk product. But wait, there's more. We can actually look at the distances traveled to particular locations, and we can put that into a spatial mapping. Here is the reason why New Hampshire's values go down. You're actually reducing distances shown by the green, especially the darker green. Those are locations where the distance traveled decreased, but it's more than offset by locations where that distance traveled increased. Okay, so we can actually add some value here by looking at this in a spatial dimension and find the particular locations where the distance traveled had increased and decreased.
Were Maine and Vermont 0 or just not shown?
Yeah, so Vermont and Maine were already consistent with the idea that all the milk was produced, processed, and consumed within that state based on our supply chain analysis and baseline. So there's no change in those 2 states. That actually carries.
So Vermont, Vermont wouldn't have a surplus for a population of 1,000,000.
Well, so they can have a surplus. We didn't constrain that all of the milk had to be used in the state of Vermont. We just said all the milk, the fluid milk that's consumed in Vermont has to be produced on the farm there, processed in a plant there, and then shipped to a location in Vermont. So we weren't allowing Massachusetts milk to be used for fluid milk in Vermont in this analysis here. So in this case, the supply chain model basically said Vermont already wants to do that. So when we imposed these other constraints about that, it didn't actually make any difference. Same thing for me. So I also said there can be cross-product effects. And so we localize fluid milk. Yogurt's not being localized, but we can look at the impact on that. And we actually see that in New York and for the Northeast overall, in March, the distance traveled to yogurt consumers from farm to plant to consumer increased, and again for the Northeast overall. No changes in these other states during the March month, but again, New Hampshire benefited from a reduction in the distances traveled when we imposed this kind of setup compared to what the baseline would have us do. And we can also look at a spatial map of this. I don't want to spend a lot of time discussing this, but the basic idea is we can have this broader set of effects on other products. And in fact, one of the things that we found that was really interesting was the following. So localizing fluid milk consumption in the Northeast had actually bigger impacts outside of the Northeast on yogurt, shown by the increased distances traveled for yogurt consumers in Georgia and Louisiana, based on the fact that this is a reallocation of an existing resource throughout the system. So these effects of one region deciding to do something can actually have some fairly significant consequences for the other regions when we look at it kind of from the system's perspective. So we can also look at the same kind of idea for dairy product miles. Again, the results are fairly similar to what I showed you previously. This is now including all miles traveled for all dairy products on a percentage change basis for the baseline. New York and Pennsylvania increased, and Hampshire went down north overall. Same basic result happens in September as well. So I'm not sure what you might have come in with your perception about how this might work, but for a lot of people, this is a little counterintuitive. Localizing means we're going to move stuff closer, so miles should decrease. What we're actually finding here, with the exception of the state of New Hampshire, bless you, is something different. So we can also look at, I'm showing this in a little bit different way here. I'm going to do this kind of by state and by the region. This is all data for March 2011, but we can look at transportation costs. You can see that for all products, and for fluid and yogurt in particular, the transportation costs consistent with the idea of distances being longer. Increased butter actually went down a bit. We see a little bit different pattern for New Hampshire than we did in New York, being consistent with the idea that those distances are shorter in New Hampshire with localization. But for the Northeast overall, we see increased transportation costs. Okay, so again, not entirely consistent with the idea of localizing. We have higher miles in total that products are traveling, and we have higher transportation costs. We also see the same basic pattern consistent with greater truck miles on the road for CO2 emissions equivalents. It's similar kind of results for the NOx and for the particulate matter. Different products have different patterns, but generally overall there's an increase in emissions, except for here in New Hampshire. Your air is cleaner, you breathe freer as a result of localization, but for overall, that's not the case. So this actually takes it on a little bit different perspective, but we have now New York, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and the Northeast states. These are looking at increases in CO2 equivalent emissions across our three scenarios: baseline, self-sufficient states, and then the self-sufficient state groupings. And the basic storyline is that we increase CO2 emissions by going through the kind of localization that we have analyzed here. And these are kind of non-trivial. They're 7 to 15% increases. So we actually talked a little bit about the potential in some areas that had higher increases for potential health impacts, particularly from particulate matter. So we actually And then we can say, okay, so one of the goals that we have for localizing is to generate additional employment. So we looked at that again through the input-output analysis that we did. And these are showing actually a change with the regionalization. This is again for the self-sufficient states being the analysis where we look at only those 5 states. And we have the different states, they are all positive. The total is positive. We are generating additional employment from this. But one of the things that's really important is the scale. Okay. So I've got change with regionalization. Let me ask for your audience participation. I've got New Hampshire has 0.1, call it. What are my units?
FTE.
Yeah. So 0.1 of a person was the additional job generated in New Hampshire from the idea of localizing basically definition. And overall for the Northeast, we are creating 2.5 additional jobs. So again, it's a positive, but it seems to me like a pretty small positive.
Dr. Nicholson, 2 questions.
Yeah, sure.
This is Seth Wilner from one of our county offices.
Hey, Seth.
Hello. So I didn't understand why transportation miles would go up. And I also wondered, would the system adapt and create processing plants closer to the farms, 1, reducing travel mileage and emissions, and 2, creating more jobs?
Okay, so the basic reason why things like transportation costs, emissions, and miles increased was milk that would otherwise want to cross a state line to fulfill demand is now being constrained, so it can't do it. And so it's going to have to go on some kind of longer routing than it would otherwise, because we're saying it has to be produced, processed, and consumed within the same state. So imagine a situation where we might want to take milk from northwestern Pennsylvania and put it into a fluid milk processing plant in Jamestown, New York, and then send it back to northwestern Pennsylvania. Can't do that anymore. So that's the fundamental kind of effect that we're seeing here when we try and use a state-based boundary to determine what localization looks like. And I will be the first to admit that there's other ways in which we could think about doing that. We have other work that looks at trying to reduce the total miles regardless of what the boundaries look like. And the second question is, could we imagine further developments in terms of additional processing facilities under this kind of scenario that would actually allow for additional job creation as well as shorter distances? The answer to that is yes, but I guess what I'll say later on is we're really trying to look at kind of a short-term reallocation. What can we do in the short term without having to make big investments that would be consistent with the idea of localization? And that's a little bit different perspective than sort of saying we let all this other stuff change. And actually, I'm going to talk at the end about how we're planning to try and incorporate that kind of effect into our analysis in the future. But 2 big questions. Did I answer it for you, Seth?
Yes, that did. Thank you.
Okay. On the economic activity side, again, the scaling here is in terms of thousands of dollars per month. For the Northeast overall, a little bit under $700,000 a month. I don't know about you, I could live on that per month. But in terms of the broader scale of economic activity, it's not particularly large if you look at the overall GDP or the size of the dairy sector in this part of the world. Okay. So again, we can also look at the change with the self-sufficient state groups. We do see actually a little bit bigger impact for that in terms of job creation, 4 jobs rather than 2.5, and a little bit bigger income effect of over 1.5 million per month. But again, relatively small sort of positive effects is how I look at what's going on here, right? So I would actually kind of characterize the conventional wisdom about what we're doing when we try to localize or regionalize food systems as we would expect large reductions in food miles. We would expect reductions, at least of some kind, in supply chain costs. We expect reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. When you listen to policymakers, you kind of get the idea that they're saying there will be really big increases in employment and regional income. And our analysis is not always consistent with that. The last two, we see modest increases, so the direction is consistent with that idea, but the size is actually not that large. And for the first three, we're actually seeing the opposite of what was expected when we think about localizing food systems. We see increased miles, we see increased supply chain costs, and we see increased emissions. Okay? So the other thing that I'll point out here is this actually doesn't really account for some other effects. Costs, in a sense, we are imposing on other regions. We don't account for increased food miles for some of the products. If I just look at the food miles for food. Doesn't account for increased supply chain costs for other regions of the country. I showed you that graph that said in the Southeast, there were a couple of locations where food miles for yogurt increased by a lot. And we would also expect for the same overall demand pool that we have out there that if we gain employment and income, somebody else is going to lose it. So if we further account for those, we actually have even maybe less a positive spin that we're seeing from this. So when I've talked about this before, I've had people come up to me and say, oh, so the conclusion is local food is bad. No, actually, there's a sausage vendor at my local farmer's market. I don't want them to go away. There's the bread people. I love them. The issue is not so much the good or bad as a conclusion, but we're adopting a little bit different perspective here that is a broader one that I think helps us to do some more productive things. A more appropriate conclusion is if we want food systems like the 50-60 idea, 50 by 60 idea, to achieve the objectives, we need to think carefully, critically, and have an empirical basis for making decisions to have the economic, environmental, social benefits that we want turn out to be true. So I would say we often need to think a little bit more carefully and critically, and having systems-oriented tools like we've done can be a helpful thing to help frame the issues and also to maybe think about what appropriate roles would be for private industry and for government, right? So the design process is really what we need to think about here. So one other takeaway is that it's quite possible that when we think about localizing food systems, we end up with some unintended consequences like the ones that I've mentioned here. And a food systems type approach where we involve a little bit more analytical capability and the collaborative effort of folks that we would involve in making decisions is probably something that we need to consider. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the limitations because I think there are actually many of these, some of which I'll talk about how we tend to address them. But the premise that we would actually be able to localize all of the fluid milk consumption within one state, given the business mentality and investments that are already out there, should be sort of challenged. And in particular, it should be challenged because there's probably some nonlinear threshold type of things. If we shouldn't try to do 100%, but we try to do 75%, we probably see something that's different than what I showed you. That's actually one of the things that we will be doing next with some updated data. We don't actually capture any dynamics here. It's kind of the question in part that Seth asked about farms reorienting their production systems, changing their locations. We can have new production facilities. We're assuming that reallocation is the short-term strategy to get us to localization, when the reality is over a longer period of time, we've taken a lot of other adjustments. We also didn't think about the investment costs that would be required across the food system to allow that to happen. I've had some great conversations with people focusing on, hey, what do consumers want and what are producers willing to produce and what's the biophysical capability of this region to make product. My supply chain perspective tells me there's a whole lot of things that have to happen in between those 2 points for this to be an effective supply mechanism for regional food systems. So we need to think about those in the future as well. So we have actually just completed an update of our 2011 data set to 2016 data. And we actually see many shifts in milk production and product demand that may change the storyline I told you here a little bit. We also are planning to examine whether effects differ by region. Northeast is relatively milk self-sufficient overall as a region. Southeast is not. So we're planning to look at some of the updated data sets, look at the differences that we see there. In particular, try and look at threshold effects. And we're also developing an agent-based model that will allow us to do more granular assessments of the dynamics of decision-making at farm processing and consumption levels. And that ultimately leads us more in the direction of answering, I think, Seth's question about investment and dynamics in the future. All right. So one quick commercial break before I open it up to questions is I am, as Shadi mentioned, an editor for an interdisciplinary systems-oriented journal called Agricultural Systems. That's actually kind of our old logo thing now, but if you are involved in work that has a systems orientation, particularly focuses on the plot, farm, or landscape level, I'd be happy to talk with you either now or by email about opportunities to publish in the journal. And so it's one of the few journals that's really focused on kind of systems analysis in agriculture. And with that, thank you a lot for your attention. If you have questions or comments on that, we're happy to do that in addition to one that says so next.
I have another one, but I can wait in line.
Yeah, we're going to wait in line if there's anything else here. Yes, sir.
I guess the question is related to Seth in that the example you had about going from Pennsylvania to New York and back, I mean, that's a local food situation. So I think your results when you start doing the more granular analysis could be exactly the opposite of what you've got so far. If you take out the artificial state boundaries, especially in the Northeast, where the states are so small, and also you pick something that is relatively self-sufficient. If you're talking tomatoes and we're talking greenhouses, then it's a totally different and open kind of a process for how local greenhouse tomato production might change things versus California.
Okay. So I completely agree with you that the idea of state-based boundaries can be considered a little bit artificial. One of the reasons that we went with that was that is one of the definitions that USDA uses to define what a local food system is, and they also have this square mile thing. So we can conceive of a lot of different definitions, and the definition will be important for figuring out what the results would be. This, I think, is illustrative, not so much because that should be the definition that we define local food by. But I'll say two things. One is, I still think that a systems-oriented approach is going to help us in the agent-based modeling that we get to it can be helpful whether we want to think about this as the scenario or another. The other thing that I'll say is when we did this national scale analysis where we said, let's reduce the miles for fluid milk as much as possible. So that gets away from any state-based boundary issues. We found similar conclusions with regard to supply chain costs and food miles. So maybe we would see a different result. It would eliminate some of those issues with cross-boundary movements like the one I identified, but I don't think it completely takes us away from that. The other thing that I'll mention is that we are just submitted a grant to NSF that we hope will be funded, like everybody does when they submit a grant, but that would look at controlled environment agriculture systems to provide vegetables to urban areas in the Northeast. And so that actually we're going to do a comparison of a lot of the same kinds of things that we have done here with some similar techniques to look at tomatoes, strawberries, leafy green vegetables, do the kind of supply chain comparisons. So that gives us another case analysis that we've worked on. We primarily started from this because I'm primarily a dairy guy. We had a tool that we could adapt to its purpose. We thought we might be able to shed some light on it. So completely agree with the basic idea there. Yes. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Chuck, for your presentation. So a couple questions. First, why was the decision just to localize fluid milk? And did you explore whether localization of the other components would make a difference in that analysis? And then second question, we know that. Okay. Second question is, we know that there are regional differences in the farm level greenhouse gas emissions of dairy farms. So Northeast actually is pretty darn good from an emissions standpoint compared to somewhere like California or whatever. So what's the value in looking just at transportation emissions when, as you said, it's such a small component of the supply chain emissions of the years?
Okay, so first the questions has to do with why fluid milk. I try to provide a little bit of justification for that, but first, nationwide, it is still close to the primary milk use among all the different dairy product categories. It's about a third of milk, so it's a big component of it. So by focusing on that one product, we would have a bigger kind of impact, if you will. The other thing is a commonly consumed product, widely consumed throughout all areas of the U.S. So we figured that would resonate with people and say this is a product that a lot of people are interested in, and it already tends to be the one that's most localized because of the bulky nature of the product itself. So we could have considered looking at other products as well. I'm kind of guessing that we'd find something similar, just the impacts would be smaller. Total milk utilization in those areas would also be small. So, and I like the second question a lot. We're not actually accounting for any differences in farm level production of environmental externalities of any kind. I guess what I would say is, in this case, we're holding that constant, and we're not trying to shift around the milk production from one location to the other. I think the localization goal, that's a dynamic issue of limitation of what we're doing. We hope to address that with the agent-based model in the future. But we're basically just looking at if we reallocate what happens. And I realize that's kind of a limited perspective, but I also think it's kind of interesting that when we do that, again, consistent with the definitions of the boundaries we're looking at, that we actually find some things that are counterintuitive. So I wouldn't at all say, boy, I've done the definitive study of the localization of dairy systems in the Northeast. But I think the bigger takeaway is really that we can end up with situations that we don't desire unless we have the appropriate frameworks to begin thinking about how complex the different interactions are. And be able to springboard from that to say, hey, we actually really should think about what's going on with farm level production about that.
Dr. Nichols?
Yeah, let's go back to Seth here first, because he's been waiting in line patiently, and then we'll go for one over there. Yes.
So the environmental and economic legs of sustainability are built into your model. I don't know if at all possible to build in the social sustainability leg. And specifically, we had an example here in New Hampshire where our dairy farmers are losing between, in theory, $2.50 and $10 per hundredweight. We went to look at an ability to spread a tax onto the consumer between 2 and 10 cents per gallon, and we couldn't because of interstate commerce rules. So Maine could, because they effectively don't import any milk. They are a net exporter. New Hampshire could not. If we were a state localized system, we could then probably intervene and pass on to the consumer. I don't know how that can be captured into a model, but it seems like there is a social aspect of this that isn't captured.
Okay, so one other thing I'll mention is that we in Pennsylvania also have a system that's somewhat similar to Maine, but we add to it by having actually regulation of the retail prices as well as the minimum farm milk price for milk that is actually produced, processed, and consumed all within the state of Pennsylvania, administered by the Pennsylvania Milk Marketing Board. So that is actually one of the issues that we hope to be able to look at when we have the agent-based model in place, because we can be a little bit more granular about that kind of an effect. And we can impose also the kind of price regulation or tax that you're thinking about here in addition. Now, what we could do with the model in this particular case is we could look at how much tax would be generated by that localization once you did it, right? So we can at least get an estimate of the gross revenue impacts for the state and therefore dairy farmers by doing that. So that would be a relatively simple extension, but we actually hope with the agent-based model to be able to look at some of the incentives that would be associated with it. I think the big issue with this, though, is how are you going to force people to say, yes, it has to be all produced, processed, and consumed within the state of New Hampshire, particularly given the small size of the state. So it's, in a sense, not realistic unless it were completely driven by consumers, because you're right, we can't violate the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Although apparently we can violate other clauses of the Constitution without that being a big issue. But but yes, we'd have to have that be driven primarily by consumers, or companies would be figuring out a way to get around it. Okay, so I mean, you also think about sort of a broader set of social dimensions that relate to the quality of life and quality of work and access to food and all that kind of stuff that we didn't directly consider, except through kind of economic values. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions?
So one more question, and then if we have more questions, we still have 20 more minutes, and we have the room across the corridor reserved for question and answer for 20 more minutes after the end of this particular class, waiting right after this.
I'll keep mine short and probably outside the scope, but what's the economic benefit or cost to the producer of regionalization? there an opportunity lost by not shipping that milk, for instance, that would go to yogurt down to Atlanta, for instance?
So that is a good question. So what's the benefit to, in a sense, saving on transportation costs if you can keep the milk local? It's interesting. I've been talking to some folks in Pennsylvania about a strategic vision for the state, and one of the things we're talking about is whether or not there are greater market opportunities to ship farm milk and dairy products to the southeast, which is a milk deficit region, despite the fact that there are higher transportation costs. So I think it would actually depend a lot on what the specific products would be, the specific product demand and transportation costs associated with that. Because producers tend to pay the hauling costs, they always want to have milk go to the closest plant, but that's in general not feasible, especially given some of the issues we've had in our part of the Northeast with regional processing capacity and peak milk production times. So,
Okay,
okay.
thank you.
Thank you very much.